Hi and welcome. I'm Suzanne Biddiscombe and I'm glad you're joining me for this presentation. Before we begin, I want to be upfront about something important. What I'm sharing today is for informational and educational purposes only. This is not medical or mental health advice, and I'm not a licensed mental health therapist. I hold both an undergraduate and a graduate degree in psychology, and I worked as a traditional mental health counselor for many years. But over time, my interest in alternative modalities, specifically hypnotherapy and what are known as energy psychology techniques, led me to break away from traditional counseling. I found these modalities were more effective at accessing the subconscious conflicts that were driving people's negative beliefs, emotions, and behaviors. Over 17 years in these modalities, I discovered that some people had what are called attachments or entities, specifically dark force entities, and that's what led me into spirit release work, focused on identifying and removing them. Today, we're diving into the world of dark force entities. By the time we're finished, you'll have a very clear picture of what they are, how they affect people, and why this work matters. This subject has been largely overlooked in psychology and hypnotherapy, and I think it's time we change that. Whether you're curious about what else might be possible in healing work, or wondering if this could be relevant to your own life, there's something here for you. So let's get into it. And here are the foundational texts that make this work possible. Two foundational texts establish the clinical framework for understanding dark force entities. Dr. William Baldwin's spirit releasement therapy is really the foundational work. He established the structured protocols and frameworks still used today, including critical work on identifying and removing dark force entities. And Dr. Shankatala Modi's remarkable healings, what she did was meticulously document case after case based on her work in Wheeling, West Virginia, and it gives us an extraordinary body of clinical evidence. If you want to go deeper into this subject after watching this presentation, these two books are where I'd start. They're all accessible even without a technical background. Now let's get into what these researchers actually discovered, starting with the core concept that ties all of this work together. So let me get into the core of this. Let me break this down in the simplest terms I can. What is entity attachment? In clinical terms, a non-physical consciousness merges or attaches to a living person's energy field. It presents as an external influence operating within the person's energetic space, uninvited, undetected, and in most cases, entirely outside the person's awareness. Today, we're focusing specifically on dark force entities or DFEs, a particularly aggressive and intentional type of entity that feeds on negative emotions and seeks to control its host. DFEs behave very differently from other types of entities and requires a very specific therapeutic approach. Let's dive into what makes them unique and how they operate. So we're going to move into this heavier territory now and talk about dark force entities. Dark force entities, or DFEs, as we'll call them. And to understand these, we need to zoom way out and look at something that's been part of human awareness for thousands of years. The concept of light versus dark polarity is ancient, and it's truly universal. It shows up in virtually every culture on Earth. Shamans in tribal and indigenous cultures worked with what they called soul loss. In 6th century Persia, a philosopher named Zoroaster formalized this idea into extreme dualism, light and goodness versus darkness and evil. And that same fundamental principle was adopted by all three of the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. I want to say something here. Every human being has both a light side and a dark side. That's just part of being human. The dark side of our nature is sometimes referred to as the shadow self. And having a shadow doesn't make you bad, it makes you human. Dr. Baldwin observed that this polarity doesn't just exist inside individuals. It plays out in mass consciousness, in communities, in the world at large. DFEs represent the dark pole of this universal duality. To truly help people who are suffering, we need to understand how these entities operate. So here I'm going to get into specifics on how DFEs actually operate. Here's what makes dark force entities distinct and why they require a very specific approach. Based on clinical observation, a DFE operates as a low-frequency energy pattern. It doesn't merely influence negative emotion, it appears to embody them: anger, fear, and hatred, to name three. The clinical pattern suggests it is drawn in by resonance with the person's emotional state. Here's the critical distinction. A DFE is intentional. Its goal is to amplify suffering, destroy relationships, isolate the person, and feed off their misery. That pattern is consistent with deliberate harm. DFEs are characteristically arrogant and deceptive. They lie, manipulate, and pretend to be something they're not. They operate through what are known as the lower chakras, exploiting survival instincts, fear, lust, greed, and a hunger for power. Once a DFE gets inside, it cannot leave on its own. It must be professionally removed. And after removal, we must seal the entry point or it will happen again. It's like fixing a leak without patching the hole. And I also think there are a few more important things about dark force entities that are important to understand. First, DFEs don't always work alone. They can operate as individuals, but they can also work in groups, what's historically been called a legion. If that word rings a bell from religious texts, that's not a coincidence. When you encounter a group, the work becomes more complex, but the principles remain the same. Therapeutically useful, many DFEs, when confronted properly, acknowledge a higher authority they will not oppose. That recognition is significant in the removal process. Now here's something tricky. Other entities can actually carry DFEs with them, like a delivery vehicle. They enter a living person and bring the dark entity along for the ride. I would reference my video exclusively on earthbound spirits to understand that. And this is why thorough work is so important. You can't just address the first thing you find and assume you're done. And perhaps the most sobering thing, DFEs can target entire family lines across multiple generations. A pattern of addiction, abuse, depression, running through a family for generations can sometimes be traced back to a DFE attachment that first occurred in a prior lifetime and has been carrying forward ever since. So sometimes when we do this work, we're not just helping one person, we're breaking a chain that's been binding a family for a very long time. So we've covered what DFEs are, how they operate, and the important nuances. The next question is, how do you recognize one? What does DFE attachment actually look like from the outside? Let me walk you through the warning signs. As I said, let's now cover the emotional and psychological warning signs of a DFE attachment. And this is a list I've compiled from years of experience and from the literature. I've split it across 2 slides because there's a lot here, and I want you to be able to really absorb each one. What you'll notice immediately is that many of these symptoms overlap with conventional psychological diagnosis: depression, anxiety, intrusive thoughts. And that's exactly the problem. These presentations often get treated with medication or talk therapy alone, and when those interventions don't work, when nothing seems to fit, nothing seems to shift, no matter what is tried, that's a real red warning flag, worth paying attention to. Look at the emotional symptoms on this slide. Unexplained bursts of anger, persistent anxiety and depression that resist treatment, inner voices suggesting negative action. So these aren't just bad days, they're patterns that seem to have a life of their own, as if something is driving them from the inside. Then notice the more subtle signs: disturbing nightmares with frightening faces, loss of motivation, and a growing tendency to withdraw from others. These are the emotional and psychological indicators, the ones that look like standard diagnosis but stubbornly resist standard treatment. On the next slide, we'll look at the behavioral and environmental signs, which are where things really start to move beyond conventional diagnosis entirely. And so now we're moving from the emotional symptoms to the behavioral and environmental indicators. These signs move beyond conventional psychology. Addiction of all kinds, substance abuse, gambling, compulsive behaviors. They intensify under DFE influence. The entity feeds on the destructive cycle. Then there are the more alarming signs: suicidal thoughts, homicidal thoughts, and a desire to harm others in multiple ways. These represent the DFE's influence escalating. Remember, its goal is to amplify suffering and destruction. Then there's territory that doesn't fit any diagnostic category. Animals reacting with fear around you, cold spots, a persistent feeling of being watched. These are things someone might be embarrassed to mention, which is why feeling safe enough to share them matters. The key takeaway across both of these slides is that no single symptom confirms a DFE attachment. It's the pattern, especially when multiple symptoms cluster together and resist conventional treatment. That may point to something deeper worth exploring. And as you're about to see, when DFE influence goes unchecked, it can manifest in some truly extreme ways. Now, let me show you some documented cases that represent the more extreme end of what DFE activity can actually look like. These represent some of the more extreme manifestations documented in the spirit release literature, drawn from verified case studies. And I want to put this in context right away. These represent the far end of the spectrum. The vast majority of cases are much more subtle. Most DFE attachment doesn't look dramatic on the outside. It manifests as emotional patterns, behavioral changes, relationship destruction, things that are invisible to the casual observer. But awareness of the full range makes us more effective when encountering something unexpected. Now, I want to show you a few examples that come directly from my own practice, from people I've worked with personally, and there's many, many more that I've encountered. These are real DFEs that I have personally found submerged inside of some of the people I've worked with. Some of these are every bit as extreme as what we just looked at. In fact, one of them is part of my DFE case study. These aren't theoretical. These are documented cases from people I've worked with directly. What's important to understand is that these entities were hidden. In many cases, the person had no idea anything like this was present. They came to me for other reasons: emotional distress, addictions, unexplained patterns, physical issues like IBS, things that just didn't feel right. And this is what was discovered beneath the surface. I share these with you not to alarm you, but so you can understand the full picture. Awareness is the first step. Knowing what's possible helps you recognize when something deeper might be at play. So you just saw what these entities can look like. Now I want to take you through a case study, placing a human face on all this, because behind every one of these images is a real person with a real story. I want to tell you about Keith. When he first came to see me, his life was falling apart. He was on the verge of divorce because of uncontrollable anger outbursts and depression. He was addicted to marijuana. He had no motivation, and he had a number of childhood traumas, both large and small, that he never truly dealt with. He agreed to a spirit release session. During the session, something dark emerged. Keith described what he called a devil taking up his entire chest area, along with black and red blotches in his stomach and groin area. That location is significant, as you'll see in a moment. Once those entities were removed, something remarkable happened. Within a week, Keith recalled that he and his siblings had been molested by a nanny who lived in their residence. That memory had been buried for decades. And what came with that memory, the emotional weight of it, is something I want to give its own space because it's very important. Now that you know what happened to Keith, let's go deeper into what he was carrying emotionally, because this is really the heart of his story. What I want you to understand about Keith is the weight of what he was holding beneath the surface. The abuse didn't just leave physical scars, it planted a deep, crushing shame that colored every part of his life. He told me that as a boy, his greatest terror wasn't even the abuse itself. It was the fear that one of the nuns at his Catholic school might somehow find out. Now imagine being a child, carrying something that horrific, and your biggest worry is that the authority figures around you will discover it and judge you for it. That tells you everything about the kind of isolation this creates. That shame and anxiety didn't just sit quietly inside of him. It demanded an outlet. For Keith, marijuana became the only way to quiet the noise. It wasn't recreational, it was survival. A child who had no language for what was happening deep inside of him found the one thing that made the feelings bearable, and he held onto it for decades. Here's where it connects. Those black and red blotches in Keith's stomach and groin were not random. They mapped directly into where the abuse occurred and where the shame lived in his body. In my clinical experience, across every case involving this type of trauma, DFEs have been present without exception. The abuse tears the opening, the shame holds it wide, and the entities anchor where the pain is the most deepest. Keith's story shows us something we cannot ignore. Trauma, shame, and entity attachment are not separate problems. They are layers of the same wound. And until you address all three layers, healing remains incomplete. That's the lesson Keith's case teaches us, and it's one I see confirmed again and again in this work. Now, I want to share another case that reinforces this pattern. A woman I'll call Hope. Her story is different from Keith's in the details, but the underlying dynamics are strikingly similar, and the transformation she experienced after the DFEs were removed is truly remarkable. So, Hope is a woman who experienced sexual abuse at the age of 6 multiple times. And like Keith, that early trauma opened the door to dark force entity attachment. Now, I want to let Hope speak for herself because her words capture the impact of the DFEs far better than any clinical description could. Hope's description is vivid. The DFEs made her physically ill, stomach pain, body aches, diarrhea, low energy. Emotionally, anxiety, heartache, and fear. And mentally, severe memory and organizational problems. She knew her brain was capable of more. She'd always been a good student, and her mom was a teacher. But something was fundamentally wrong. The DFEs were not a surprise to me. As I mentioned during Keith's case, I have found DFEs in every single case involving sexual abuse, addictions, traumatic households, people that have been in traumatic events. They're always there. But the trauma Hope experienced at age 6 created exactly the kind of vulnerability that allows DFEs to attach. And remember, these were multiple DFEs, not just one. The outcome speaks for itself. Once the DFEs were removed, Hope earned her LPN license, started a fulfilling job, and began dance classes. From stomach pain, cognitive dysfunction, and fear to achievement, purpose, and joy. That's what spirit release therapy can do. Now that we've seen the real-world impact of dark force entities through Keith's and Hope's cases, let's turn to the science. What does modern research tell us about this work and why it's possible? Let's get into the science now, starting with something you can actually see. This is where it gets really exciting from a scientific perspective. Konstantin Korotkov is a Russian scientist who developed something called GDV technology, and that stands for gas discharge visualization. And what it does is remarkable. It can actually visualize the human biofield, the energy field, in real time, non-invasively, meaning nothing touches you, nothing hurts. It simply reads and displays your energetic state. What his research demonstrates is something that energy healers have known intuitively for a very long time, but now we can see it and measure it. We are fundamentally energetic beings. We are constantly both conducting and receiving energy. We're not solid, static objects. We're dynamic fields of energy in constant interaction with everything around us. And here's the part most directly relevant to everything we've been talking about. When we experience emotional or physical imbalance, stress, trauma, grief, illness, Korotkov's technology shows measurable openings, gaps, and distortions in the energy field. You can literally see them on the screen. Those openings are exactly the entry points we discussed earlier, the places where entity attachment can occur. So what healers have been observing for decades, this technology can now confirm visually and scientifically. And it's just the beginning. Wait until you see what HeartMath has found. From biofield imaging, we move to what might be the most well-established body of research in this entire space. The HeartMath Institute's work on the heart's electromagnetic field. When we're trying to understand how one person's consciousness could draw to itself the consciousness of another person, even one no longer in physical form, HeartMath Institute gives us some of the most compelling scientific evidence available. They've been studying the biomagnetic field of the human heart for over 40 years. 40 years of rigorous, peer-reviewed research. And what they've proven, not suggested, not hypothesized, but proven, is that the heart is not just an organ that pumps blood. It is essentially another brain. Using scientific instruments that simply did not exist a few decades ago, they've measured the electromagnetic field that every human heart generates. This field extends well beyond the body. It radiates outward into the space around you, interacting with the fields of other people. Perhaps even more significant is the discovery of the heart-brain interface. There is a constant, active, two-way dialogue happening between the heart and the brain, with each organ influencing the other's function through 4 distinct pathways: neurologically, biochemically, biophysically, and energetically. What this means is profound. We're not just isolated beings. We're constantly broadcasting our emotional state through our heart's electromagnetic field and constantly receiving the broadcasts of others. That has enormous implications for understanding entity attachment and especially for understanding what protects us from it. And I think here's where HeartMath's research gets truly practical, because they didn't just discover the field, they discovered what makes you resilient within it. Here's the key findings, and I think this is one of the most empowering things I can share. HeartMath discovered that when a person maintains positive emotions, they are not degraded or affected by negative energy sources coming from other people. But that protection only works when the person can sustain what HeartMath calls a state of coherence. So what is coherence? It's a state where heart, mind, and emotions are all energetically aligned and working cooperatively together. Think of it like an orchestra where every instrument is playing in harmony versus one where everyone's playing a different tune. Coherence is indicated by sustained, positive, emotional, and mental stability, not a momentary good feeling, but a consistent, maintained state of balance. Here's what's counterintuitive. When you're in this coherent state, you actually become more sensitive to the electromagnetic signals coming from other people's hearts. You would think that would make you more vulnerable, but the opposite is true. When people can sustain this coherent balance, they become more internally stable and less vulnerable to being negatively affected by the fields around them. Their increased internal stability seems to act as a shield. Think about what this means for entity attachment. Coherence is protection. Maintaining positive emotional alignment doesn't just feel good, it literally makes you less susceptible to negative energy influences, including entity attachment. So for those who need strong scientific evidence, HeartMath Institute is certainly providing it. Now let me connect this to the broader picture. Let me weave together what we've learned from HeartMath with an even bigger picture, the quantum perspective, or what is known as the new science, on how reality actually works. Let's follow the logic through. If a person is emitting negative emotions through the electromagnetic field of their heart, HeartMath has shown that they become susceptible to the negative emotions of others. An interface is created, a connection, an opening. And here's what's remarkable. Both indigenous tribes and ancient cultures around the world believed, independently of each other, that what they called possession could only occur when the person was unstable, physically, mentally, emotionally, or spiritually. When you lay HeartMath's findings alongside these ancient traditions, the alignment is striking. Now let's zoom out to the bigger picture. The classic physics model, the Newtonian worldview, says we live in a universe of separate objects, separate things, separate people, where interaction only happens through physical force and separation defines reality. The quantum model says something completely different. It says there's no true separation, not between objects, not between people, not even between mind and matter. We draw experiences, people, and energies to us that match our own frequency. We attract what resonates with us. HeartMath has essentially proven this in a measurable way. We are constantly interfacing with the world through the electromagnetic field of our hearts, broadcasting our emotional state like a radio signal. The final piece of our scientific framework comes from a brilliant biologist who's been challenging conventional thinking for decades. Let me introduce the work of Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, because his research connects beautifully with everything we've been discussing. Sheldrake is a biologist and researcher who coined the term morphic resonance to describe the invisible connections between people. What he points out is genuinely profound. Our mental activity, our thoughts, our consciousness, if you will, is not confined to inside our heads. Our thoughts are not private. Let me say that again. Your thoughts extend beyond your brain, sometimes far beyond. We walk around assuming that what happens in our minds stays in our minds. But Sheldrake's research, along with HeartMath's findings about the heart's electromagnetic field, tells us that's simply not how it works. Our consciousness radiates outward, just like the heart's field radiates outward. Sheldrake's concept of morphic fields gives us a framework for understanding something many of us have experienced. Thinking of someone, and then they call. Knowing something has happened to a loved one before anyone tells you. That sense of being watched that turns out to be accurate. These aren't coincidences. the real phenomenon that morphic field theory explains through invisible channels of communication that keeps organisms connected across distance. Here's where this directly answers the question running through our entire discussion. How do entities become attracted to specific people? It's the coherence between them, matching emotions, matching behaviors, matching frequencies. Just as HeartMath showed that emotional incoherence creates vulnerability, Sheldrake's morphic resonance explains the mechanism of attraction itself. The entity and the person are resonating on the same frequency, tuned to the same station. When you put all three pieces together, Korotkov's biofield imaging showing the openings, HeartMath's research on coherence, and Sheldrake's morphic resonance explaining the attraction, you get a really compelling, scientifically grounded picture of how and why entity attachment occurs. It's not supernatural in the way people might think. It's actually based on real science about how consciousness and energy fields interact. And now that we understand the what and the why, let's talk about what we actually can do about it. So let me walk you through the specific reasons why hypnotherapy is the tool of choice and how each of our two key researchers used it in their own way. Hypnotherapy is the absolute cornerstone of spirit release work. And the reason is straightforward. It's the only method that gives us direct, reliable access to the subconscious mind, the exact level of consciousness where entity attachments operate. So, if a dark force entity attachment is operating beneath conscious awareness, talk therapy won't reach it. Assessments aren't designed to detect it. Medication masks symptoms without addressing the cause. Hypnotherapy bypasses these limitations and accesses the source directly. Both key researchers used hypnotherapy, each brilliantly. Dr. Baldwin developed a structured step-by-step protocol for guiding people into trance, then systematically scanning for and dialoguing with attached entities. He created spirit release therapy as a structured discipline. Dr. Modi documented hundreds upon hundreds of cases where hypnotherapy revealed dark force entity attachments that were missed by every other form of diagnosis. People in the mental health system for years with no resolution. In my practice, hypnotherapy is the most effective tool for bypassing the conscious mind's defenses and connecting directly with dark force entities if they are present. The most common concern people have is losing control. Let me put that to rest right now. And like I just said, losing control is the most common concern about hypnotherapy. And I do want to address this head on. During hypnotherapy, you're always in control. Always. Full stop. And I cannot emphasize this enough because the single biggest barrier to people seeking this kind of help is the fear that they'll lose control. And this is a misconception unsupported by clinical evidence. Stage shows and movies created the image of a puppet master taking over your mind. Therapeutic hypnosis is nothing like that. Here's the reality. In order to enter a hypnotic state, the person must be willing to follow the guide's suggestions. So if someone doesn't want to go there, they won't. It's really that simple. You cannot be hypnotized against your will. This is a cooperative process. I'm a guide, a facilitator. Your own mind does the real work. And at any point, you can simply open your eyes and stop. So you're never trapped, never stuck, never out of control. And here's what surprises most people. The conscious mind stays fully engaged the entire time. You're not asleep. You're not unconscious. People almost universally say afterward that they are aware of everything. They could hear my voice very clearly. They knew exactly where they were. They remember every detail of the session. That conscious awareness is actually essential because it means you can report what you're experiencing in real time as we navigate the subconscious together. With the science, the nature of dark force entities, the treatment approach, and the safety of the process covered, let me pull everything together. So we've covered an enormous amount of ground here. So, like I said, let's pull all the threads together. We started with the fundamentals, what dark force entity attachment actually is, a non-physical consciousness merging with the living person's energy field. Simple concept with profound implications. We explored dark force entities in depth, intentional, aggressive entities feeding on negative emotions, requiring professional removal and sealing of the entry point. Then we dove into the science. Korotkov's GDV technology showed us that we can literally see and photograph the energy field and its openings. HeartMath's 4 decades of research proved that the heart generates a biomagnetic field that interacts with the world around us, and that coherence, positive emotional alignment, actually protects us. The quantum perspective showed us that separation is an illusion, and that we draw resonant experiences to us through our energetic state. And Sheldrake's Morphic resonance explained the invisible channels of connection that allow attraction between entities and people. So the golden thread through all of this is emotional resonance. Whatever the person's primary negative emotion, the attached entity matches it. Every single time, across over 200 cases, sessions that I've done with these entities. A pattern too consistent to attribute to coincidence, suggesting a fundamental mechanism is at work. Finally, hypnotherapy, why it works, how you maintain full control, and how slowed brainwaves bridge conscious and subconscious mind. The most important thing to take away from this presentation is this. If you or someone you know is struggling with symptoms that just won't respond to traditional approaches, therapy that doesn't seem to help, medication that manages but doesn't resolve, patterns that keep repeating despite every effort, there may be something else going on, and there is help available. This work is grounded in clinical experience, supported by converging lines of scientific research, and has produced documented, life-changing outcomes. And with that, here's how to reach me. Thank you for your time and intellectual engagement. I hope this presentation has offered a new lens for examining the intersection of consciousness, energy, and healing. For more in-depth information about spirit release therapy in general, please read my ebook, An Introduction to Spirit Release Work. I have additional case studies in it, supporting research, and the pioneering contributions of Dr. Baldwin and Dr. Modi. It's a short read that deepens the full picture. So if anything resonated, if you have questions or want to explore further, I'd love to hear from you. And you can reach me at thesourceforchange.org, thesourceforchange@hotmail.com, or simply text or call me at 561-398-1139. And all my sessions are via Zoom, so the location, wherever you might be in the world, is fine. We can work together. And I want to thank you again for your time and your open mind.